Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for tuning in and joining us for our Wednesday night Bible study. You will notice things look a little bit different. You're getting a little bit more widescreen view of my office, for one thing. And secondly, I usually add a piece to my background decor every week. And you'll notice that the piece that I've added this week is this fella right over here. We sometimes have vagrants that walk around the parking lot and come by the building, and so I decided to just allow him to come in and join me tonight. But no, for the brethren here at Lakeside, you know that this is our brother Glenn Price, and I'm glad to have Glenn with me tonight. I've been thinking for a while about maybe some ways to kind of freshen up and change up the monotony of just me right in front of the camera and looking at my ugly mug for the entirety of our studies. And so Glenn graciously agreed to jump in and join me tonight. So
it's good to be here. It's good to get a chance to talk to everybody. It's the first time I've been in the church building for a while, so that feels good. He said his ugly mug, I think he picked me, so he'd have a prettier mug
That's
than
right.
me. So
That's
find somebody
right.
uglier than him.
I'm looking really good tonight. As you see on the screen, we are in Mark the 8th chapter. We're going to be working in verses, starting at verse 11 and working, I'm hoping, down through the rest of the chapter tonight. Rick asked me at the beginning of the quarter that began at the beginning of March if I thought I'd be able to cover all of Mark in one quarter, and I said probably not. But this is officially the end of this spring quarter, and so if we get done here, we've covered half of Mark tonight, and so we'll see if that's possible or not. Glenn and I may get discussion going, and we're in Mark 8 again next week, but we'll see. We're going to pick up in verse 11, but I do need to remind us of what happened in the first 10 verses, because this little scene in the first 10 verses is going to get spoken of again in just a few moments by Jesus. In the first 10 verses, you'll remember that Jesus had performed the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000, and a lot of similarities to the feeding of the 5,000, and we noticed some of that last week. But that event evidently did not sear into the minds of the disciples kind of the lessons that Jesus wanted them to take away from that, and so he's going to bring that up again here in just a few minutes, and we'll get to that. But let's build up beginning in verse 11. So let's read a little bit here. Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. Glenn, why don't you read those for us?
The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them and got into the boat again and went to the other side.
All right, so Jesus has, of course, already done miracles in front of the Pharisees before, but we have some that have now come and they are asking for, maybe even demanding to some degree, that he do a sign, do some kind of a miracle for us, Jesus. And my inclination, kind of already knowing how these guys operate, my inclination is to say, Jesus, you show them. You just give it to them, Jesus. You know, dry up the Sea of Galilee right there, and that'll show them. Or, you know, blow up Mount Carmel, or make them levitate right there on the spot. That's what I want Jesus to do, is just put them in their place. But that's not actually what Jesus does. Instead, Jesus, he knows their heart. It says in verse 12 that Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. You know, we noticed a sigh in the previous chapter, where I think that was a sigh of compassion. This is a sigh of exasperation, of these guys again. You know, I know what these guys are here for. These guys are here to test. These guys are here to push buttons. He knows that they're not genuine. He knows that they're not sincere in asking for this miracle. They're wanting Jesus to do something on their terms. That's what they seem to be interested in, is pressing Jesus to conform to them and what they want. You know, hey little monkey, you know, do a dance for us whenever we want that to be done. Paul's already chimed in with a comment. You go ahead.
It's a shame. They've seen all these miracles he's already done, and they're not going to believe no matter what. And I think that's why he signed.
Yeah.
Nothing he can do is going to cause them to believe. And, you know, God allows us to have the ability to make up our own mind about things. He also allows us to be deceived if that's what we're striving for. And the Pharisees, all these religious leaders, they didn't want to believe.
Yeah.
And since they didn't want to believe, he did not give them something that was proof beyond any kind of doubt for them. He allowed them to not believe if they did. And we have that same choice. If we don't want to believe, we can read it. It can say, well, that don't apply to me, and just go right on. He will allow us to believe wrong.
Yeah. The truth is, he'd already done plenty of miracles for them, and they weren't able to deny them, any of the other ones before. In fact, when he did do miracles, what did he usually, the accusation was, well, he's doing that by the power of Beelzebub. Well, why would Jesus then give them just more ammunition to keep saying things that are just, absurd and wicked and false? Paul's chimed in here with some references from Matthew chapter 7 and also in Luke as well. But Matthew 7 about what Jesus says about seeking and you will find. And the promise is that those who have the right kind of hearts and motives, they're going to find. They're going to receive what it is that they are genuinely seeking. And not to throw our pearls before swine. And Jesus is going to set the tone and the example of why that's just, we're not going to do that with folks who have impure motives. Paul's got another one here from in regards to verse 12 from Luke chapter 16 with the rich man, how he thought that if somebody from the dead would go in and warn his brothers, of course, that they would repent. And Abraham said, if they're not even going to hear Moses and the prophets, then they're not going to hear them. And that's the result of a hardened heart.
He goes on to tell them there that they wouldn't believe if somebody came back from the dead.
Yeah.
And who did that? He did.
The very guy, yeah.
And they still didn't believe him.
Yeah. Jesus is not a circus act, and so he's not going to do miracles for performance. In fact, this actually reminds me of, and this may be a good place to kind of put a note about this, Paul echoes that problem in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 22, when he talks about that the Jews always demand a sign, and even the apostles weren't going to, get sucked into that same kind of thing. The Pharisees here are not asking for more evidence because they're truly seeking. Instead, they're actually just looking for a reason not to believe even more, to kind of help harden them even more in their unbelief. And so Jesus does not humor them on this occasion. He leaves them, gets in the boat, and going to go to the other side. And so that then brings us to this next section. Jesus is actually going to turn, I think, this episode with the Pharisees, he's going to turn that into what he hopes is maybe going to be a teaching point for his disciples. So we pick up in verse 14. Let me find on my screen here. The print is so small I can't see it from this far away. There we go. Verse 14. Glenn, why don't you read verses just 14 and 15 to start?
Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and when they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leavening of the Pharisees and the leavening of Herod.
All right, so they're in the boat, and Jesus, I think, is wanting to seize upon what had just taken place with the Pharisees, and he realizes that the disciples are in their mind, or they're discussing this issue that they had forgot to bring bread. Well, how can I tie that in to what just took place and issue some warnings for the apostles here? So he says, watch out, be on guard, be alert for the leaven. Leaven, of course, is kind of the key ingredient in baking bread. Watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. And he says the leaven of Herod. I think the leaven of the Pharisees is exactly what had just taken place here. This demanding of signs when there's not sincere seeking going on, not humoring people that are clearly in hardened unbelief. I think there's maybe kind of a dual warning here. Don't allow yourself to become like the Pharisees. But at the same time, when you guys are out doing these miracles, when the time comes, don't fall for these guys. Don't get sucked into their games that they're playing. Be on guard for that. And the same thing with the leaven of Herod. You read in Luke 23 and verse 8. What did Herod demand? He demanded a sign, just like the Pharisees were demanding so here. And so Jesus wants to issue what hopefully is going to be a very helpful warning for the disciples while they're thinking in terms of bread. Before we look at the next thing, my mom's got a comment here. Speaking of literal hearing, was this a miracle that the huge crowds of people could all hear him speak or not? Let me keep working with that question again. Literal hearing, was it a miracle that the huge crowds of people could all hear him speak or not? I actually talked about this once in one of the Q&As about how could large crowds of people hear Jesus, like when he's doing the Sermon on the Mount or when he's out by the Sea of Galilee, and how there's kind of some natural amphitheaters in those places, and that helped to just create natural amplification of sounds. I don't know whether miraculous things were taking place in order to cause Jesus to be heard always in those circumstances. I don't know. The text doesn't say.
He had the ability. We know that there's natural places that work as amphitheaters.
Yeah.
He may have chose those. However, it doesn't make any difference. We know what the message was, and they were able to hear it.
Yeah.
And he definitely had the ability to project however he wanted to. So,
yeah.
However, he got his message across.
That's right. And the fact that there's response from people, and the fact that these things are recorded now for us today, maybe some of that's kind of irrelevant. It maybe it's a curiosity, and I understand why we want to know about those kinds of things. But let's talk about then this scenario. So Jesus is talking to the disciples about this issue with watching out for the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. And notice what the disciples do in the very next verse. Verse 16, please. Can you read that, Glenn?
And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread.
All right, so we studied Mark in the young adults class last year, and this kind of become kind of a running joke with the young people in there, that they were so concerned about this bread. I think they just could not stop thinking about the fact we forgot bread. Can you believe we forgot to bring bread? Here's Jesus trying to teach them and say some things that are really important, but what about that bread? Man, I can't believe we forgot that bread. And that's actually a very human thing. I can't tell you how many times I've been in conversations with someone about spiritual matters, something biblical, and you're kind of developing an important point and kind of working along in the text, and you think they're kind of following along, and then all of a sudden they say, what's the word Bible mean? Or just something off the wall, and it's like, well, hold on, are we really going to have to backtrack all the way and discuss that? That's kind of what's going on here. There's concern about this bread, all the stuff Jesus had said.
They didn't understand the leaven idea at all.
Evidently not.
He was talking about the influence, and he wasn't caring whether it was Cairns or rainbow bread. That was what he was talking about.
That's right.
The whole point was the fact that you can be influenced and keep yourself away from that. Same thing we have to watch for.
That's right. And this is the struggle that Jesus has had. We've seen this several times already in Mark, where he's wanting the disciples to think a little bit deeper and to kind of do some digging. We talked about that with the parables, that was kind of the purpose of the parables, to get people to think a little bit deeper, look beyond just the surface, and think of what's really going on here. And so, aware of the fact that his disciples completely miss this, they're still thinking about, actual bread in their hands, Jesus then says this, verses 17 through 20. You could read that, Glenn.
And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember?"
So this is this. What did you read through 18?
Yeah.
Go ahead and read 19, 20. Yeah, go ahead and hit those two. Yeah.
When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said unto him, 12. And really, the same thought keeps on here.
Go ahead and read 20.
And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said 7. And he said unto them, do you not yet understand?
All right, so maybe the one thing we'll say, all right, the disciples are ahead of the game further than the Pharisees, because they do have faith in Jesus. They are following him, so we're going to give them credit for that. But they've still evidently got some ways to go in their maturing, and that's what Jesus indicates here. He harkens back to a couple chapters ago with the feeding of the 5,000. Did you guys not take inventory and stock of what took place there, the significance of that? And if you missed it on the first go around, why didn't you catch it on the second time when I did it with the 4,000? And not just even the feeding themselves, but then even kind of the after effects of it, where there was all the leftovers as well. That's kind of a continual reminder of what's taken place here. Do you not yet understand? And I guess there's a couple ways we could read that, and I don't entirely know because the text doesn't give us the tone. Maybe he said this, very sternly. Come on, guys, don't you understand? Come on, get with it. It may have been more of a kind of a parent with their child of kind of slowly walking them along, and maybe that the relationship Jesus has with the disciples maybe is more along those lines of aren't you yet putting the pieces together and remembering and piecing things? Is your vision, are you not seeing with spiritual eyes yet? Looking beyond just the physical, but looking to the spiritual things and the ramification of what's taking place here. I want to make a point about that a little bit further as we look at this next scene, but thoughts before we get done with 21.
It's amazing that after they did it once, that here a short time later, that they seem to be amazed he did it again. And they still don't understand that he's God.
Yeah.
And he can do anything. And that's hard to wrap your head around, that they cannot get this. But I don't know where it's much different than us.
It's not.
Many times, the people will do the same thing over and over, and they don't seem to understand. They don't ever get it. And until we're willing to look at it serious and apply the things that we read, just as we were talking about earlier, that God allows us to believe the wrong thing. If that's what you want to believe, you want to try to work something around to where it fits whatever your preconceived notion is or what you're wanting to do, you can figure it out, and that's why you make it.
We're not any different from the standpoint that we need repetition. Peter wrote a second epistle, and in that epistle he even says, I'm kind of saying some repeat stuff. Yeah. But it's needful by way of reminder, and he doesn't apologize for that. And it's because we do need that. Sometimes, we don't get it on the first pass, and we need a second pass, or we need a third or a fourth pass before finally the light bulb, finally goes off, and we start to get it. And that's just growth. That's just the way that works. And thankfully, the Lord is patient with us and allows that. Verse 22, we then get this miracle that only Mark's gospel records, at least all of the details of this particular miracle. Verses 22 through 26, let's actually just read this miracle in its entirety and what takes place here. Glenn, go ahead and read that.
And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes, and he's laid his hands on him, he asked him, Do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored. And he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, Do not even enter the village.
All right, this miracle causes some people to kind of have some questions about Jesus. That why did Jesus need to do this miracle twice? This really is the only miracle that we know of that he essentially did twice for the same person in order to achieve the final result. Was there just some kind of a power shortage on Jesus's part, that he needed to do it a second time, just didn't get it through the first time? I'm going to argue that no, that's not the case. He didn't need 2 tries. I actually think what we're seeing here is I think we see Jesus healing partially on purpose because he's wanting to make a point. And let's keep in mind the things that we've already seen thus far with the altercation with the Pharisees, this episode with the disciples. I think he's performing this miracle in this way to convey a spiritual reality that's befitting of these last couple of scenes. I think Jesus is reflecting for us the 3 conditions that actually exist really for all people when you really want to boil it down to it. And I've put this little chart together. You see what you think of this. You have people who are blind. You have people who cannot see clearly. They can see some, but they don't see all the way. And then you have people who have much more clear vision in spiritual terms. That first category, I think, well describes the Pharisees. Those are people they didn't see, And in fact, they really didn't even want to see. That was the biggest problem with them. They weren't seeking the truth. Instead, they were seeking their own kind of justification or propping themselves up. And as a result, they are spiritually darkened. Yeah, they can see with their physical eyes, but they are as blind as a bat spiritually.
Having eyes but can't see.
That's exactly right. The second category of kind of having this blurry vision, like with this man, where Jesus, does the miracle on the first pass, where the guy ends up having partial vision. It says, I see people, but they look like trees. Okay, he's able to see something. He's just not able to see it exactly correctly. And I think that kind of describes where the disciples were in their growth and understanding. They had partial vision. They saw some things,
but no clarity.
They didn't have the clarity. In the words of Jesus, they didn't have the understanding that they needed. They're still learning. They're spiritually dull. Then, kind of on this far end, we have this blind man who he really wants to see. In fact, the text says he's begging Jesus to touch him. He is seeking and wanting sight. To go back to the seeking thing that Paul mentioned a little bit earlier. And the result of that is he's granted exactly what it is that he wanted. He's granted the clarity. Jesus does the miracle the second time, and he has 20/20 vision. I'm gonna hope. And I think that describes the idea of the person who's able to see more clearly, has spiritual vision, so to speak. And when I look at this little chart here, it's pretty clear I don't want to be in the category on the left. I really want to be in the category on the right, but if I'm being honest, a lot of times
we're somewhere's in the middle.
I'm usually in the middle where the disciples are.
And to get to that other one that wants to,
yes,
is the most important thing. God will allow us to get there if we want to.
Yes.
But we have to want to.
There has to be the desire. There's nothing wrong with being in that middle category there where we have, we don't understand everything perfectly. I mean, nobody is expected the moment they come up out of the waters of baptism to understand everything about the Bible or about the kingdom of God and what their role is and how to do everything perfectly. But the fact is, we can't be satisfied to remain in that second category. There needs to be the pushing forward, the progressing, the desire to grow, to not just be on the milk of the word forever, but I want to progress to the meat. And that's what Jesus is trying to get his disciples to move along to that category, and that's where we need to be as well, working and pushing in that direction. The good thing is, and actually, well, let's just pause there. We got some comments we need to probably get caught up with. Paul here, Linda had said some things, Miss Linda's joining us from Indiana again, that they didn't understand yet that he is going to provide for all their needs. They know what he can do, but they don't get that he's not putty on a show, but he is teaching. I like the way he's putting on a show, but he's teaching. I appreciate that. The evil influence of Herod, corrupt, exactly. Paul's commented here again that Jesus' lesson could mean haste makes waste. Doing something too quickly can sometimes mean that a teaching opportunity is wasted. And I do think that's correct. Kind of, we're thinking about this scene here in the boat again, and kind of just making use of what's taken place and the circumstances and what ought to be fresh on our minds. John 16:12, that I still have many things to say to you, but you can't bear them right now. That's exactly right. Jesus knows, that the time is slowly drawing near. I said last week, I think, that we're within kind of the final year now. And he's probably starting to feel some of the weight of knowing that he's got to get these guys ready and prepared. But at the same time, he can't just unload everything on them. They're not going to be able to bear it right now. It's the analogy I always use is it's like trying to take a drink of water from a fire hydrant. Yes. The human brain just can't take it all at once.
Their whole concept of what the Messiah would be was wrong.
Yeah. And
had been taught that way. So they had to overcome that. And even though they've seen all this, and seen the miracles and been with Christ, they're still in that middle group. Their spirituality, their understanding of what Christ is going to do is just not there yet.
Yeah.
And it's too much for them even a year later to absorb.
That's true. And things will, after the resurrection, lots of pieces fall into place where they are able to have, probably as close to 20/20 vision as they were ever going to have. But it's a process, and Stooks just kind of echoed that we have to want to get that clear vision, and that is the key. And the good news for the disciples here is they are going to get that opportunity to have a little bit more clarity as they now approach Caesarea Philippi. So that brings us to verse 27. Let's read a little bit here, verses 27. Let's just go ahead and read 27 through 30. Glenn.
And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist. And others say, Elijah. And others, one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter said unto him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
All right, so as Jesus comes to Caesarea Philippi, this is actually the furthest north that he's going to go, because after this, everything is headed in the direction of Jerusalem. And it's as they're on their way, I always like the idea of Jesus just kind of seizing every opportunity wherever they are. If they're just walking down the road, we'll do some teaching, do some talking, kind of spontaneous Bible study, so to speak, which makes me think of Deuteronomy 6, what, Moses had in mind for parents with their children, that it's not just the sit-down Bible study sessions. It's more of, we're just going to talk about the Lord in all different settings and venues, and Jesus is doing that. And he just brings up the question, hey, you guys kind of have your ear, kind of attuned to what's going on around you, and what's the scuttlebutt? What are folks saying about me? What do you think people are saying that I am, or who I am, and what I'm all about? And they give him a kind of a myriad of different responses. Some folks are saying John the Baptist, and that kind of makes some sense. John the Baptist was preparing the way. He taught a lot of the same things Jesus was teaching. There's a lot of similarities with those guys. They were cousins on top of that. Even Herod, when he started hearing about Jesus,
he thought it was John coming back for him.
Exactly. So that sort of maybe would make some sense. Others were saying Elijah, and that probably would make some sense too, because John the Baptist was after the spirit of Elijah. Yeah. And so if Jesus, like John the Baptist, was probably like Elijah in a lot of ways, or some of the other prophets, just the way that Jesus spoke and conveyed the message of God, the way that Jesus some of the miracles that he did would have probably caused people to think of some of the prophets who did miraculous things. But really what he's most interested in, all right, I want to know what you guys think. Who do you say that I am? You're the guys that have been with me now for the last year and a half, 2 years, however long now. From being in close proximity with me for this period of time, what's your conclusion?
And Peter, as usual, first one speaking.
It is Peter. We should not ever be surprised that it's Peter's the first one to speak up. And let's give Peter a gold star on this occasion. He says the right thing. He gives the right answer. It's exactly what should be said in that moment. You are the Christ. And this is one of those places that I always appreciate the text, the way it's rendered. You are the Christ, because it's a good reminder that Christ is not Jesus' last name. Christ is really not even a name at all. It's a title. It's a designation. It speaks of the role that Jesus plays. It's the word Messiah in the Hebrew. It means the anointed one of God. And Peter is saying, Jesus, you are that one. You are that anointed one that we've been waiting for. You are the one that's been talked about, hundreds of years prior by the prophets. And so this is my acknowledgement of that. And I think Peter's probably speaking on behalf of the other 11 guys too, just giving voice as he often is. This is a high moment for Peter. Now, I point that out because it's going to kind of come right back down here in just a second.
He has some low ones, doesn't he?
But the idea is there, I guess, is the point. Again, they're in that middle category. He's saying the right things. He understands some things, but doesn't understand fully. And that kind of comes to full view in this next section of verses. Let's notice here in verses 31. Let's just do 31 through 33. 31 through 33, Glenn.
And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and by the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men.
All right, so, hey, wow, Peter finally gets it. You're the Christ. You know, what a great acknowledgement. We might be wondering at the end of verse 30, it says Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Well, Jesus, why won't you let us go tell it and spread it? Well, the reason is because you don't actually fully get it yet. and that's evident by the way that Peter responds here. Let's just notice a couple things. First of all, about verse 31. I'll kind of argue, and I've got this written in my scripture journal, that this right here, this point, this is the centerpiece of Mark's gospel. This is the first occasion in Mark where Jesus has just flat out stated emphatically in no uncertain terms what his mission is, what he is going to do, and what's going to happen. Mark goes out of his way to say that Jesus, verse 32, he said this plainly. Up until this point, Jesus has kind of said some veiled things that are kind of in metaphors. I think about in chapter 2 and verse 20, he said, that the bridegroom will soon be taken away, and then it'll be time for weeping. Okay, that's the kind of thing that I got to kind of think about that, and what exactly did he mean? But now, there's none of that. I'm just going to lay it out there plainly about the things that I must suffer.
Now that they understand he's the Messiah, now he's going to tell them what the Messiah's role is.
Yeah.
Because, the Jews thought the Messiah is going to come back and kick the Romans out and make Jerusalem a great thing again.
Yep.
That's not what's going to happen.
No.
So now you recognize who I am. Now you're going to have to learn what the true Messiah is going to do.
Yeah. The way that the Messiah is going to establish his kingdom, you guys aren't quite there yet, and we're going to keep seeing that that's a problem over the next few chapters. The disciples, their lack of understanding about the nature of the kingdom and how that's going to be established. So Peter gets some things about the Christ, but he just doesn't get the fullness of what the Christ is coming to do. He's not coming to bring a kingdom by force or by military, but he's going to do that in really the most unexpected way. He's going to do that by giving himself in a full self-sacrifice. He's going to be the fulfillment of what Isaiah 53 had talked about. Be the lamb brought to the slaughter, though he was, totally innocent. And Peter doesn't get that. And so that's why he speaks up, and he's just like, now, Jesus, no, you're over here talking about you're going to die, you're going to be killed, you're going to be taken, and all these things are going to happen. You might want to note there in verse 31 the mention of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. That's the Sanhedrin Council. That's who that's talking about there. But Peter's like, no, Lord. That can't be. There's no way that's going to happen. It's not going to be this. We won't allow that to happen. God certainly would never allow such a thing like this to happen. This cannot be. And then Jesus, just as bluntly and probably as forcefully as he could. My translation, the ESV, puts an exclamation point at the end of it, and I think it probably should be there, when he says, "Get behind me, Satan." And that's kind of off-putting a little bit when you read that on the first pass. Wow, I've been mad at people before, but I've never called somebody the devil. Jesus has the authority to do that, though. And
well, he's trying to really get his attention here.
Yeah,
this isn't a rebuke of "no, you're wrong." He's adding that exclamation point in the way he's saying it. Calling him Satan realizes you're not on my side anymore.
Yeah.
When you say this.
Yeah. And this is not that somehow, in that moment that Satan had somehow, came into Peter and he was saying this. I think it's just Jesus is saying, you're essentially, by saying what you're saying, you're being a mouthpiece for the devil, because this is exactly what the devil would say. I'm reminded of when Jesus was in the wilderness and he was being tempted by the devil. What the devil was offering Jesus in the wilderness was shortcuts. The devil said, look, I'll give you all the kingdoms. Hey, you want to have a kingdom? I'll give you all the kingdoms of the whole world. All you got to do is just bow down and worship me. You don't need to die. Don't need to go through all the pain. Don't go through all of that lengthy process. Just fall down right now and worship me. You'll have all the kingdoms that you'll ever want. And Peter, by speaking here and saying this, no, Lord, don't do it that way. This can't be. It's not going to be that way. He's essentially giving voice to what Satan would be saying in these circumstances, if Satan were, physically right there and had the opportunity to talk.
He doesn't want to do it God's way.
Yeah.
Which is what happens to a lot of us today. We'll read the Word, and this is what it says, but we really don't like it like that.
Yeah.
We wish it was different, or it doesn't make sense to us like that. So when we do that, we're on the wrong side.
And it's in those moments it would be helpful if we could be reminded of it as if Jesus was saying it to us. Then get behind me, Satan.
Yes.
This is not. We're going to do this God's way. This has been God's plan that's been designed for, all the way from, you go all the way back to Genesis when it's mentioned there about, crushing the serpent's head. Linda's chimed in here, got a note here from Mike that Jesus is making clear that the battle is with Satan. And that is right. When we're talking here about a kingdom, it's not that Jesus is concerned about the Jews coming back to prominence so that we can win this fight against the big bad Romans. His kingdom is going to be about a fight against Satan and spiritual forces. And yes, sometimes Satan operates and works through governments or other entities like that, but it's a spiritual battle here, and it is with the devil, and that is what he's wanting to emphasize here. Again, it's a problem with Peter here of there's physical sight, and there's not the thinking of longer term, deeper in spiritual terms, and that's why he's kind of pushing Peter here a little bit. We might think he's being kind of tough on Peter, but Peter needed it.
I think we have to remember, it seems like they're having a hard time getting this, but these were religious people, and they had grew up with this and had been taught this. So the fact that they were having a hard time accepting that they had been doing it all wrong or looking at it the wrong way, they may have had 30, 40 years of studying this and accepting it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And we have to be careful that we don't get caught into that we prove what we believe. And we've met other people. You talk to people that in the religious world, and many times they're fighting that same preconceived notion that they've been taught all their life, and they just can't see anything else.
Yeah.
And it's we need to make sure that we don't do that.
Dad commented here that Peter actually is puffing up to rebuke Jesus the Christ, which is, I don't know that I would have the gumption to do that, but Peter did. Maybe Peter he had a relationship with Jesus that obviously was very unique. But he does, and then Jesus, brings him back down a peg or two. In some ways, Peter has essentially, by doing this, he's basically just denied what he just confessed. Mm-hmm. If Peter had really thought through a passage like Isaiah 53, he would have realized that, yeah, Jesus, you said you're going to die, and you're going to be, and I know that you're an innocent man, and you're going to be taken through the ringer in this way. Yeah, you know what? That's what Isaiah 53 does. Well, he wouldn't have known chapter 53, but that's what the book of Isaiah says was going to happen to the Messiah. They're just not all the way there yet, and Jesus is helping to get him there. He actually is not just concerned about the disciples here, the 12 getting it. He wants the other followers that are obviously still there and following him and around the vicinity. He wants them to get it too. So beginning in verse 34, he kind of pulls them back into the conversation. So let's actually just grab 34 through the end of the chapter there, if you don't care to read that, Glenn.
And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said unto them, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels.
All right, if I were to just kind of summarize those verses, it probably would just be three words that Jesus uses in some of the parallel accounts, and that's the words, count the cost. That's what he's trying to stress here. You need to think about what being a follower of mine really involves. That it can't just be, just kind of passive and and being kind of I've kind of used the term of just being a fan of Jesus. It's about full life commitment, being fully devoted to Him. He uses the wording there of losing our life for Him so that we can actually find life, so that we can have what real life is supposed to be about following Him, denying self. I mean, that's the essence of being a Christian. The words that he used there in verse 34 about taking up your cross and following me, I put this image on here down there in the bottom right corner. That's not, I wasn't able to make it too big, but we see that image and we hear folks talk about taking up the cross and talk about, this is my cross to bear. And that sometimes gets kind of used and is used way too liberally. People use that to describe their various aches and pains that they're dealing with in maybe their physical body, or if they're talking about, just an ornery boss at the workplace or my in-laws. Well, I knew what I was getting into when I got married, and that's just my cross to bear. Well,
that's not a give your life for, and that's what the cross
That's exactly right. That's the difference
give
here.
Your life.
That's right. Some of the daily pains and hardships we endure in life, they can help us to become stronger as Christians, but that's not this cross. This is the cross, as you said. It's the cross that Jesus would exemplify in actually giving himself up entirely, emptying oneself, the way that Paul talks about in the book of Philippians. This is about the trials and the difficulties and the hardships that we endure because we are following Christ. Mm-hmm. That's what Jesus wants his folks back then. It's what he wants people today. You need to think about that. In some of the other accounts where he talks about it, and he gives the little parables about, building a tower and, sitting down and counting the cost beforehand. He wants people to give consideration to that before they jump headlong into something that they're not going to see through to the end. And we need to be mindful of that. First of all, for those of us that are already Christians and we've made that decision, we need to do some re-examination of our lives when we look at verses like this. All right, am I giving the Lord fully? Am I denying myself and giving up what I want all the time for the benefit of Him and His kingdom? The total self-surrender, Dad's put the comment here about. And if I'm not a Christian, then I definitely need to look at those verses and I need to say, am I actually willing to do all that? The idea of eternal life, well, yeah, everybody wants that. Am I willing to do this stuff in the meantime?
We've got to make sure that the leaven of all the religious world around us doesn't affect us.
Yeah.
Because everybody, there's a commercial on TV that's on there every 15 minutes now. Just pray the sinner's prayer and you're fine. There's not much cost to that.
Yeah.
It doesn't match what the Bible says. And it allows, if we're not careful, we'll let that affect us to where, well, we're doing a lot more than them, so we're good enough. I think we have to examine ourselves and make sure that we're actually sacrificing our own wants to do what's right.
Yeah. The disciples were doing better than the Pharisees were.
For sure.
But Jesus is telling them it's more than that.
And the Pharisees were doing better than the Sadducees.
Right.
We get down on the Pharisees because they took it too far. Many of the things added their own stuff. But at least they were trying. They weren't just denying that God was even a spirit.
Yeah.
But, so
you can always find somebody who's doing
worse than you.
Doing worse than you. Dad's put the quotation. It's from Galatians 2 and verse 20, and we sing that song with the kids. Been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. And that was Paul, the Apostle Paul, echoing that kind of after the fact. Jesus is kind of putting those thoughts, planting the seeds for that now, even before he's actually gone to the cross and the resurrection and all the things that go along with that. He's pushing hard here in these verses. He's just pushing hard here for people to make a choice, to make a decision about Him and what they're going to do in their lives. I do want to say it's kind of interesting, verse 36, the verse there that talks about what's it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his own soul. What's interesting is that no one who has ever rejected Christ, no one who's ever rejected Jesus, has ever actually gained the whole world. No. Every person in the history of humanity who has rejected the Lord they still didn't end up gaining the whole world anyway. Which says to me that people will actually sell their soul for a lot less than the whole world. Pretty cheap.
Yeah, pretty cheap.
But that's a verse that really ought to give folks pause, especially if they're living outside of Christ and outside of His will. Jesus wants there to be some immediacy to this decision of following Him and doing so fully, because chapter 9 verse 1, we actually ought to get chapter 9 verse 1. This is not a great chapter break. Let's grab chapter 9 verse 1. Hit me with that, Glenn.
And He said unto them, Truly I say unto you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after He has come with power.
All right, so the reason I say there's some immediacy in this kind of invitation that Jesus has given here about, choosing to follow me fully, is because He says some things are going to be happening pretty soon in the lifetime of those people who were right there at that time, living in the first century, roughly 30 AD, in that time frame. Things are going to be happening. This kingdom that I've been talking about and people are looking for, it's going to be pretty quickly on the horizon. It's not going to happen in 1948 in Palestine, like many of our premillennial friends tend to think. This is something that's going to happen for those people right there, and they needed to make a choice about where they were going to be when that kingdom comes in its full iteration. Stooks kind of followed up on the comments that we made about verse 36, that if you win the whole world, then that's actually all that you're going to have for the next bazillion years, plus bazillion, infinity. And so you better have a really long memory if that's all that you have. And it's kind of a unique way of putting it, but that's the reality of what Jesus is stating here, taking a daily self-inventory. Doyle's chimed in here, and that is what these verses ought to prompt us to do if we're Christians, is to think about just where I am in my level of service and commitment to the Lord. That's a good place for a stop. Obviously, we're at the end of chapter 8, and so that's going to be a good place. We'll probably come back, and I want to say some more things about chapter 9, verse 1, because it is a very helpful verse when we talk about premillennial ideas and things of that nature. But I want to save that for next week, and we will look at this episode at the Mount of Transfiguration. I did want to say before we jump off of here, especially since I've got somebody else here with me to kind of, I think probably to echo our current conundrum that we're facing as a congregation, and trying to figure out and sort out what's going to be the best way forward as far as reassembling together, in our church building. Of course, for the last 9 weeks now, we've been setting up different things for us to be able to meet in the parking lot, those who are able and those who have felt comfortable with doing that. And we've had great attendance for all of those, and we've been kind of modifying and tweaking things as the weeks go on, and especially in the last couple of weeks, some things freed up here in the state of Kentucky that made it possible for now we're not restricted to our cars. We can actually get out of our vehicles and set up chairs.
I've enjoyed that. Being able to be outside. It's
being able to see each other's faces a little bit more clearly, to be able to converse back and forth, to be able to, if we're able to be able to sit close enough to be able to sing and to hear one another. I've gotten to enjoy that for the last couple weeks. Folks that have sat up around the kind of the perimeter of the carport, and that's kind of helped with amplifying the sound. And trying to gradually work our way back into the church building. And I know with those, the truth is we are not unique at all here at Lakeside in trying to figure out everybody's thoughts on that. I have lots of preacher friends and lots of friends in congregations all over the state and even outside of Kentucky who are thinking about that and wrestling with that. And I know what everybody's desire is. Everybody's desire is that we're back together, like normal, and we can carry on with our worship and not have to worry about the different distractions. We're not having to, do things in kind of a remote, virtual sort of way.
And isn't it good that we have such concern about it?
Yeah.
Because if people weren't faithful and they weren't really concerned about doing things right, they wouldn't be in controversy.
Yeah.
They'd just be happy. Just whatever.
Just do whatever.
But this is going to take a while to get everything worked out. and to get it to where, even when we were doing it outside, it took us several times to where we got it to where it was working very well.
Yeah.
Even our audio, we had to make a few adjustments. But we're blessed that we have so many people that are so sincere and are wanting to get back into the building. And I think we need to do it gradually, especially those that are older like me, and some of them that have more health have more health problems. Need to be careful, and this may take us a little while before we get it right. But everybody needs to be patient and see if we can't get back in the building to where we can all worship like we used to. And in the future, we'll probably have a whole lot better appreciation for getting to do that.
Yeah.
I took it for granted and just didn't think about such a thing would happen to us.
Yeah.
But hopefully that we can get back in there.
We've all probably learned some lessons that looking for some positive silver linings and all this, and that certainly is one of them. Our appreciation for one another, our desire is heightened even more to be together. I look forward to when we're able to give a hug and give a handshake and not have to worry about, is that okay? All of that. I'll throw this out for the benefit of everyone. I don't know entirely what Sunday is going to look like. I think the discussions about that have still been ongoing, and maybe the jury is still out. If we are still outside, or if there are folks that are inclined to remain outside, even if we do have something opened up on the inside, I would encourage folks, if you're comfortable, to please do. Let's get situated where our singing can feed off of one another. The last 2 weeks, Glenn has been within, 10 feet or so of where I am, and so I've kind of enjoyed getting to sing bass again and kind of feed off of Glenn's bass singing, and that's been a good thing. And just having even more kind of be a part of that setup would be great. I actually am of the belief that actually if we could have enough, we could do that without kind of the additional accompaniment of some of the recorded music that we've been using and singing along with. Those are just kind of the steps that I think we could kind of start to implement to get us to where we all are comfortable to be back in, and do that in an appropriate way, do it in a safe way. Dad's actually commenting here that people in other places do meet regularly outside, and that is the case in certain parts of the world. That's probably been a good lesson for us, for us to not be so spoiled with our luxuries that we have. But it is our desire to serve and to please God, and to know the kind of fellowship that God's people have when we come together to worship and to do His things. And like I said, I was glad to have somebody else here tonight to kind of echo that sentiment, and it not just be coming from myself. And I will just reiterate what I put in the bulletin from Ephesians chapter 4. Probably ought to just be something that we're praying about regularly as well, when Paul says being eager to maintain and to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And the way that we do that is by demonstrating humility and gentleness and forbearance and love for one another, and doing all of that so that the body can be edified and can grow and can be everything that God intends for His church to be. I know that has to be a regular fixture in our prayers, and if it's not, start praying for that. That needs to be a regular part of our praying daily, and I don't think the Lord's not going to say no to that prayer. The Lord's not going to say no to doing things that bring about the unity of His people and drawing us closer, instead of causing us to feel like we're separated even more. So anyway,
that's true.
Appreciate everybody joining us. You got any other thoughts before we close?
No, it's good to be here. It's a new experience for me.
Well, I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed getting to have somebody to kind of tag team partner this with. Glenn, the door is open to do this next week if you're inclined to. If there's others that want to join me, or I know Dad would even like it on Sunday night, to kind of have others to participate in that, the invitation is open. We don't want this to, I don't want it to just be my class. I've enjoyed having comments and getting to incorporate those into our discussions, but even better to get to do a little bit of that in person. Looking forward to picking up in Mark chapter 9 next Wednesday night. This Sunday, though, whether you're here at the building or whether you're at home and not able to be here in person, get online. You'll see here in just a second what's coming up for Sunday. But you all have a good night and good rest of the week.